I found out about Laura's betrayal by accident. The phone rang at 9:43 p.m. when she said she would be working late. An unfamiliar number, a short message. Laura just walked into her apartment on Mason Street. Not for work. I didn't answer. I just took my jacket out of the closet and went there. Mason Street was quiet as usual. The apartment in question was on the second floor. Light curtains, light inside. I went up the stairs without thinking about what I was going to do next. There was a sign on the door, recreation and relaxation. Nothing more. I knocked. The door opened a minute later. Laura stood in front of me in a black robe. She froze. I watched her face turn pale and her hand on the doorknob tremble. "Nick," her voice broke off on a half note. I looked at her in silence. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to collect herself. I pulled an envelope out of my inner pocket and handed it to her. "Sign." Laura looked at him, then at me. "Is this a joke?" "No." She crumpled the envelope in her hand, but I didn't budge. "How long have you known?" "It's enough to get everything ready." Laura pursed her lips and went inside, leaving the door open. "Come in, since you're here." I didn't. "This is no longer my home." Laura wanted to say something, but instead she just took a pen from the table by the door. She signed the papers quickly, without looking at them. I took the envelope and, before I left, said, "I hope it was worth it." Laura did not answer. As I was going down the stairs, I heard her close the door. No screaming. No tears. I got in the car and drove off, leaving Mason Street behind. In the rearview mirror, the apartment remained visible for some time before disappearing from view completely. The next few days were strange. Laura did not write or call. I didn't look for a meeting either. The apartment became absurdly quiet. Her clothes were still in the closet, and her teacup was on the windowsill. I packed everything into a box, leaving nothing behind. When I took her things out to the car, Rocky, our Labrador, was sitting on the stairs looking at me with incomprehension. "She's not coming back, man," I said, putting the box in the trunk. Rocky sighed softly and lay down by the door. I took her things to her office. The reception was empty. I left the box by the desk and wrote a short message. "Your things are in the office. Go get them." No unnecessary words. In the evening, when I returned home, I saw her car outside the house. Laura was sitting inside, holding the steering wheel. I stopped at the door, waiting for her to come out. She didn't move. I walked past without stopping. Laura appeared on the doorstep a minute later, leaning against the door. "Don't you want to talk?" I looked at her over my shoulder. "It's too late to talk." "Nick." I raised my hand, stopping her words. "Laura, you have made a choice. Now let me make mine." She looked at me for a long time, as if she was waiting for me to change my mind. "I thought you would forgive me," she said quietly. "The problem is that I understand you. But forgiving is different." Laura nodded, lowering her head. "Is that all?" "That's it." She left without a word. Rocky sat down next to her, watching her car pull away from the house. I sat down on the porch, stroking him behind the ear. "Now we are alone, my friend." Rocky laid down, leaning against my leg, as if agreeing that it was for the best. 2 months have passed. Laura never showed up at home or near the office again. No messages, no attempts to accidentally run into me in the city. She seemed to have really accepted it as much as I had. The apartment began to change. I replaced the curtains, got rid of her plants that had long since withered away, and finally hung a painting that she had always called too gloomy. Rocky quickly adapted to the new routine. In the mornings we ran in the park, and in the evening we sat in the backyard. One day, during a regular walk, I met Tom, an old friend who knew about the situation but did not interfere with advice. "Hey, Nick," he said, tossing the ball to his retriever, "why are you still alone?" I laughed, patting Rocky on the back. "I'm fine the way I am. I'm not saying you're not well, but you can't stay like this forever." I shrugged my shoulders. "Maybe a little later." Tom smiled and didn't bother anymore. ####. That evening I went out on the terrace with a glass of wine. Rocky was lying next to me, looking up at the starry sky. I listened to the silence that used to seem unbearable, but now became part of my life. Over time, I realized that I no longer thought about Laura the way I used to. Perhaps Tom was right. But for now, I was satisfied with this silence, and I was in no hurry to change it. A week later, on my way home from work, I saw her car outside the house. Laura sat inside, her fingers nervously drumming on the steering wheel. I slowed my pace but didn't stop. I opened the door, and Rocky immediately ran out to meet me. "Laura," I nodded briefly, stopping on the porch. She got out of the car, holding the door as if she wanted to run back in. "Can I come in?" Her voice was quiet, uncertain. I leaned on the door frame and looked at her. She looked as if she hadn't slept for several nights. "Why?" "Just to talk." I looked at Rocky, who was hanging around curiously, as if he was also waiting for me to answer. 5 minutes. Laura nodded and went inside in silence. There was a silence in the apartment that clearly alarmed her. "Everything has changed here," she said, glancing at the new curtains. "Yes." She stood in the center of the living room, as if she didn't know where to put her hands. "Nick," she began, sighing, "I didn't come to ask you to come back." I sat down on the arm of the sofa and crossed my arms over my chest. "This is good. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I didn't answer anything. Laura came closer and sat down on the edge of the couch, as if she was afraid that she might be chased away. "It won't change the past, I realize. But I thought you should hear it." I paused, letting her words sink in deep. "I realized this a long time ago." Laura clasped her hands together and rubbed her fingers nervously. "Are you feeling better?" I ran my hand through Rocky's fur, who lay down at my feet. "Yes." She looked at the dog and smiled slightly. "Is he still your main ally?" "Now it is the only one." Laura nodded, stood up, and walked to the door. "If you want to talk." She pulled a piece of paper with a number on it out of her pocket and left it on the shelf near the exit. I walked her to the door, watching her get into the car. When her headlights disappeared around the bend, I went back to the living room, sat down on the couch, and picked up that piece of paper. Rocky raised his head, looking at me intently. I clutched the paper and threw it in the trash. "I think we're doing a good job as it is." Rocky sighed and closed his eyes again. A few more months passed. Laura never showed up again. The piece of paper with her number remained in the trash, covered with old newspapers and checks. Life went on as usual. Work, walks with Rocky, evenings on the terrace with a glass of wine. Sometimes Tom would stop by for a beer, and we would sit in the garage for a long time, listening to old tracks that had been playing back when we were carefree students. One day, when I came back from the supermarket, I saw someone new on my porch. She was sitting on the stairs, dressed in a light sweater and jeans, with a book in her hands. Rocky was already sitting at her feet, as if they had known each other for 100 years. "I hope he's not disturbing," I said as I walked up the stairs. The girl looked up and smiled. "On the contrary, he fascinated me." I put the bags by the door and held out my hand to her. "Nick." "Megan. I live across the street." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I'd seen her before. "Have you just moved?" "Almost 2 weeks ago." It's just that I work from home more, so I can hardly go out. Rocky licked her hand, and she gently scratched him behind the ear. He's a good dog. Is he always this calm? Only with those he likes. Megan smiled wider. I was lucky. We talked some more. It turned out that she was a designer and had moved to this city after a divorce. A new beginning, she said. As I was bringing the packages inside, Megan stood up. I often go out in the evening. If you and Rocky happen to be up for some company. I nodded. We will be happy to do so. Rocky looked at her as if he had already invited her for a walk. When she left, I left the door open, watching her silhouette disappear around the bend. Rocky lay down by the door again, watching the street. You make new friends quickly, I said, sitting down next to him and patting him on the back. Megan began to appear more often. At first, it was short meetings at the mailbox or casual conversations in the street while Rocky circled her feet, begging for a favor. Then one evening she knocked on the door with a bottle of wine in her hand. I have too much, she said, smiling. I need help. I led her to the terrace, where we stayed until the last glimmer of the sun disappeared. Rocky came between us, as if to bring us together. How do you like living here? I asked when she put down her empty glass. It's quiet, Megan replied, but I like it. After all the chaos in my life, silence is a luxury. I nodded. I know this feeling. She raised her head, looking at me for longer than usual. Did you have your own storm too? Until recently. But now everything is calm. Megan ran her fingers lightly over the glass. Calmness is good. Sometimes it is the one that saves you. She stayed until late in the evening, and when she left, Rocky walked her to the gate and came back to me. I stood on the doorstep for a long time, watching her cross the road and disappear behind the door of her house. ####. The next day I met her again during a morning walk with Rocky. Let's go for a walk together today, she suggested. Why not? We walked along a path along a lake I had long forgotten about. The water was calm, and the sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon. I didn't think anyone else was out here at this time of the morning, Megan said, peering into the water. Rocky dictates the schedule. I adapt to it. She laughed. It looks like he's not only your dog, but also your trainer. Rocky heard his name and barked cheerfully, as if agreeing with it. When we got home, Megan stopped at her house. Thank you for the company. It hasn't been this easy for a long time. Likewise, I said, watching her disappear behind the door again. Rocky remained sitting at the gate, watching her go. Don't look at me like that, I smiled. Everything is happening exactly as it should. The dog sighed softly and followed me home. The next evening Megan appeared on our terrace again. This time without wine, but with a large container of homemade lasagna. You don't mind, do you? She asked, coming inside as if it had always been like this. If it's the same lasagna as you described yesterday, then I definitely don't mind. Rocky immediately snuggled down at her feet, expecting to get at least a piece. You won't get anything, Megan said, patting him on the head, it's not for you. Rocky sighed sadly, but remained sitting next to him like a loyal bodyguard. We ate on the terrace, watching the sun go down over the horizon. The evening was warm and quiet. It's kind of cozy here, Megan said, looking around the backyard. It's simple, no unnecessary things. And so it happened. She raised an eyebrow. Because of that storm you mentioned? I took a sip of wine and nodded. After everything, you want to keep only what is important. Megan twirled her fork in her hands, thinking for a moment. It was the same for me. After my divorce, I gave up almost everything just to start from scratch. We sat in silence, each deep in thought. I think we're doing a good job, she said, smiling. Rocky definitely thinks so. The dog, hearing his name, raised his head again and wagged his tail. When Megan was about to leave, I walked her to the gate. "Thank you for dinner," I said, leaning on the gate. "And thank you for the company." She stopped for a second, as if she wanted to say something, but just smiled and walked to her house. Rocky sat down next to me, looking after her. "I think you approve of her," I said, scratching him behind the ear. Rocky sighed with satisfaction. It seemed to me that this was the best sign that could have been. A month has passed. Megan became a part of our evenings as naturally as Rocky became a part of my life after Laura left. She often dropped by unannounced, with warm bread, a bottle of wine, or just company for a walk. We hadn't arranged it, but each time I realized that I was starting to look forward to these meetings. Once, when we were sitting on the terrace, Megan said, "I'm thinking of getting a dog." I looked at Rocky, who raised his head and looked at her carefully. "He is not very happy with this idea," I joked. Megan laughed. "I think he needs a partner." Rocky put his head in my lap, as if to remind me that he didn't need partners. "Seriously," she continued, "I realize that I miss having someone around when I come home." I nodded. That's how it all starts. At first, you just want company, and then this person becomes a part of you. Megan thought for a second, then looked up and said quietly, "Perhaps this applies not only to dogs." I didn't say anything. We sat in silence, listening to the wind swaying the branches of the trees. When she left that night, I noticed that her fingers lingered a little longer on my hand as we said goodbye. Rocky walked her to the gate, then turned and looked at me as if he knew something. "I feel it too, my friend," I said, closing the door. ####. The following week, Megan brought home a puppy. She called me almost at midnight. "Nick, help me. He's already chewed up 2 shoes and can't stop." I laughed as I pulled on my jacket and walked out to her house. The puppy was a little black ball of energy, scurrying around the living room. Rocky just stood there and watched, obviously not understanding what all the chaos was about. "This is your new friend," Megan said as I sat down next to her on the floor. Rocky sighed tiredly and lay down next to him, watching the puppy with the indifference of an adult who has seen it all. "What did you call it?" "Max." I ran my hand through the puppy's fur, which finally calmed down. "I think you'll have more fun now." Megan smiled and said quietly, "You'll help me with him, right?" "Of course." Rocky raised his head and looked at me, as if deciding whether he was ready to share space with another person. "You don't mind, do you?" Megan asked him. Rocky sighed again and closed his eyes. It was his way of saying, okay. In a few weeks, Max was fully acclimated. The puppy was everywhere, chasing around the yard, trying to steal food from the table, and constantly pulling shoes in his teeth. Rocky watched him calmly, sometimes intervening when Max went too far. One morning I went out to the terrace with coffee, and Max was already running on the grass, dragging Megan's old sneaker. "He collects trophies," she said, following me out. "Is this the 3rd pair he has destroyed?" Megan sighed and smiled. "Only the 2nd one. But I think this is not the limit." Rocky was sitting under the terrace, watching everything, like an older brother who decided he was tired of raising his younger brother. Megan sat down next to me and pressed her shoulder against me. "Thank you for helping with him. I think he helps Rocky stay young." She laughed, and I put my hand on her back, feeling her relax a little. "Don't you think we've turned into 2 crazy dog breeders?" I shrugged my shoulders. "But it's fun." Megan nodded and took a sip from my cup before wrapping herself in the blanket again. "Have you noticed that we spend almost every evening together?" "Yeah. But you don't mind, do you?" "No, I don't. I just think it's even better." Rocky raised his head and looked at us from the side, while Max got his head stuck in the flower garden and tried to pull out a pot. "Do you think he'll grow up to be calmer?" Megan asked, watching Max. "You had a chance to choose, but you chose the most energetic one. They always choose you, don't they?" I looked at her, and she met my gaze with that slight smile I was beginning to love. "Maybe," I answered. Rocky got up, walked over to Max, and gently poked him with his nose, pulling him out of the flower garden. Max barked happily and ran to Megan, jumping around her. "It looks like I have 2 bodyguards now," she said, stroking both of them. "This is a good start." The evening descended slowly. We sat on the terrace, listening to the wind rustle the leaves, and I felt like I was finally in my place. One evening, when Max finally fell asleep at Rocky's feet, Megan turned to me with a cup of tea in her hands and suddenly said, "I'm thinking about moving." I put the book down and looked at it carefully. "Are you going somewhere far away?" She smiled, but there was a slight uncertainty in her eyes. "No, not far away. Just closer, here." The wind gently swayed the curtains on the terrace door, and for a moment it was completely quiet. "Are you serious?" Megan put her cup down on the table and squeezed her palms together slightly. "Seriously. I'm tired of running back and forth every day. Max already spends more time here than at home. And so do I." I leaned forward, putting my hand on hers. "I don't mind if you ask." She breathed a sigh of relief. "I've already put out an ad for the sale of the house. So it's a matter of time?" Megan nodded, her fingers gently intercepting mine. "I hope you don't think it's too soon." I looked at Rocky, who was sleeping peacefully next to Max, as if they had been doing this all their lives. "If it's fast, I don't think I mind." Megan smiled and picked up her cup of tea. "Well, then all that was left was to help me with the move. We have Rocky and Max. I think they can handle half the work." She laughed, but did not take her eyes off me. "Thank you, Nick." "Why?" "For not stopping it." I just squeezed her hand lightly. Rocky opened one eye, looked at us, and went back to sleep as usual, knowing that everything was going exactly as it should. Megan's move went faster than I expected. A week later, her house was already empty, and the boxes were in my living room, cluttering up the space. Max was spinning around, pulling one of his toys into each box as if he was helping with the unpacking. Rocky watched from the couch, only occasionally glancing at the chaos with a slight look of disapproval. "Do you think we'll survive?" I joked, carrying another box to the kitchen. Megan stood on the stairs with her hands at her sides, looking thoughtfully at it all. "If not, we will live among the boxes." She walked downstairs, rubbing her hands on her jeans, and stopped next to me. "It's a little bit like a new beginning," she said, watching Max run around the room. "Sometimes starting over is exactly what you need." Megan looked at me and said quietly, "Thank you for doing this. I would say that you did it." She smiled and ran her hand over my cheek. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. In the evening, we sat on the terrace, watching the dusk slowly fall on the yard. Max, finally tired, fell asleep next to Rocky under the terrace. "You know," Megan said, looking toward the lake, "I thought it would be hard for me to trust anyone after everything." I turned to her, noticing her fingers nervously playing with the sleeve of her sweater. "And how do you like it now?" She looked me straight in the eye. "I think I've already done that." I took her hand and intertwined my fingers with hers. "And so am I." Megan put her head on my shoulder, and Rocky lifted his head as if to check if I was okay. Max, without looking up, only moved a little closer to him. It was a new stage. And this time I knew that we were both ready for it. The next few weeks flew by unnoticed. The house slowly came to life. Megan brought in her little things, books, photographs, an old vinyl record player that she took out of the box on the third day and turned on right away. At first, Rocky didn't appreciate the loud jazz playing in the living room and simply went out onto the terrace, lying down on the rug in defiance. Max, on the other hand, ran around as if the music was a background soundtrack for him. One evening, when I was putting things away in the kitchen, Megan came over with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "We need to celebrate." I raised an eyebrow. "Anything special?" "The first week without a single broken cup or missing shoe." I laughed, wiping my hands on a towel, and took the glass from her. "What do we drink to?" Megan tilted her head slightly, thinking. "For doing a good job." We clinked glasses, and she sat on the windowsill, looking out into the courtyard. I would never have thought that I would enjoy living in the suburbs. "And how do you like it?" Megan took a sip and smiled. "It's quiet. But it seems to be what I needed." At this point, Rocky came back out onto the terrace, walked around the circle, and laid down right under her feet. "He can't imagine his home without you," I said, watching him. "I think I am too." I came closer, touching her hand. "I'm glad you're here." Megan looked up and squeezed my palm. "And me." Max, meanwhile, dragged another shoe into the living room, but no one paid any attention. We stayed in the kitchen until evening gave way to night outside the window. One Saturday morning, I woke up to Max jumping on the bed and Rocky lying lazily by the door, blocking the exit. Megan was sleeping, hiding under the covers, but when Max started to poke his nose into her shoulder, she moaned softly. "Nick, take this brat away from me." I laughed and pulled Max's collar. "Come on, buddy, let her sleep a little more." But Max did not give up, waving his tail so that it slapped the sheet. Megan finally raised her head and said through her sleep. "If you want me to get up, at least bring me coffee." "It's a deal." 20 minutes later, we were sitting on the terrace with cups of hot coffee. Rocky was lying at our feet, and Max was chasing his tail all over the yard. "He never gets tired," Megan sighed, looking at him. "This is exactly what keeps Rocky in shape." Megan put the cup down and leaned against me, wrapping her arms around my hand. "You know, I thought that after the divorce it would take me much longer to feel at home again." I ran my fingers through her hair. "And now?" "Now I realize that home is more about people than a place." Rocky raised his head and looked at us with understanding, as if agreeing with her words. "I think he thinks so too," I said, stroking his ear. Megan raised her head and looked me in the eye. "I'm going to stay here for a long time, if you don't mind." I leaned closer and kissed her. "I am more than in favor of it." At that moment, Max flew onto the terrace and pulled one of the pillows off the chair, dragging it across the yard. "And I see that Max is determined to stay, too," Megan added, laughing. Rocky, instead of intervening, just lay down and covered his eyes. We sat on the terrace, listening to the wind rustle the leaves, and I felt that nothing else was missing. A few months later, life in the house became calm and stable. Max grew up, although his energy remained at the same level. He was constantly dragging something from the house to the yard, a pillow, a sneaker, and once he even pulled a blanket out of the living room. Rocky, like a true elder, sometimes intervened, but mostly just watched, sighing and returning to his favorite rug. One evening Megan came home from work a little later than usual. I was preparing dinner when I heard the door open. She was standing in the hallway with a mail envelope in her hands. Her face was tense. "What happened?" I asked, wiping my hands on a towel. Megan nodded and slowly sat down on the couch. Max immediately ran over to her, putting his head in her lap. "This is a letter from Tyler." I sat down next to her. Tyler is her ex-husband. We hardly ever talked about him. "What does he want?" Megan tore open the envelope, and her fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter. She read in silence for a few minutes. Then she looked up at me. "He wants to meet up. He says he's moving back to the city. I felt something tighten inside, but I didn't say anything. And you want to meet? Megan put the letter on the table and ran her hand through her hair. I don't know. Rocky raised his head and looked at both of us closely, as if he sensed the tension. If you want to talk to him, that's fine. Megan turned to me and leaned closer. Nick. I don't want this to change anything between us. And it will not change. She looked at me for a long time, as if trying to make sure that I really meant it. I will meet with him. Just to close this page. I took her hand and squeezed her fingers. I understand. Megan smiled, although there was still a shadow of anxiety in her eyes. Thank you, Nick. Max lifted his head and licked her hand, making her laugh. At least someone is always on my side, she joked, hugging Max. Rocky seemed to breathe a sigh of relief and put his head on his paws. We sat together until darkness enveloped the house. The meeting with Tyler took place a few days later. Megan said they had arranged to have coffee at a small cafe in the center. I tried not to dwell on it, but I was restless all morning. Rocky, as usual, sensed my condition. He followed me around the house in silence while I moved things aimlessly from place to place. You realize I'm just waiting for her to come back, I told him, sitting down on the terrace. Rocky sat down next to me, resting his head on my lap, as if agreeing with every word. Max, meanwhile, was spinning around the yard, trying to catch his own tail, completely oblivious to the tension. ####. Megan returned home in the late afternoon. I heard the car door close, but I didn't get up from the terrace. Rocky didn't move either, just waited for her to come out into the yard. Well? I said when she stopped at the door. Megan sat down across from me, sighing as if this was the longest meeting of her life. It was strange, she said, wrapping herself in a blanket that was lying on a chair. In what sense? She thought for a few seconds, then looked at me. He has changed. He became calmer. And he spoke as if he wanted to start from scratch. I clenched my fingers but forced myself to remain calm. And how do you feel? Megan put down her cup of tea and leaned over to me. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Is this good or bad? She smiled and took my hand. This means that I am where I am supposed to be. Rocky looked from me to Megan and then put his head back on his paws. It looks like he's breathing a sigh of relief, she joked, stroking his ear. Because it is. Max ran up to us, carrying an old toy in his teeth that he had pulled out of the bushes. Megan laughed, wiping away a tear that had appeared in her eyes. I think I had to do it to understand something important. And what exactly? She leaned over and kissed me lightly. That I've been home for a long time. Max barked as if to support this statement and jumped onto Megan's lap. Rocky didn't move again, watching everything with the wisdom of someone who had seen more than others. We sat on the terrace until it started to get dark outside. And this time I was sure that no ghosts from the past would destroy our peace. The next morning, everything looked normal, as if yesterday's conversation was just another chapter that we had closed long ago. Megan was already standing in the kitchen making coffee when I walked in, stretching after her nap. Max was spinning at her feet, and Rocky, as always, was lying quietly by the door, watching everything like a silent guardian of the house. Do you have a meeting today? Megan asked, pouring me coffee. Yes. This afternoon. Tom wants to discuss a new project. She nodded and sat down on a stool opposite me, hugging the cup with her hands. I'll be working late too. We're preparing a presentation for a new client. We talked about ordinary things, but I felt that every day these little things were becoming more important. ####. In the evening, I returned earlier than I had planned. Megan wasn't home yet, so I decided to go out on the terrace, taking a beer from the fridge. Rocky sat down next to me, looking carefully at the road leading to our house. "Are you waiting for her?" I asked, patting him on the head. Rocky wagged his tail, keeping his eyes on the gate. Half an hour later, Megan's car appeared on the road. Max, hearing the sound of the engine, immediately rushed to the gate, barking with joy. Megan got out of the car with a box of pizza in her hands and a slightly tired but happy expression on her face. "I thought we deserved something tasty after a long day," she said as she walked to the terrace. Max was jumping up and down at her feet, and Rocky just stood up, wagging his tail slightly. "You read my mind," I replied, taking the box and putting it on the table. We were sitting on the terrace eating pizza. Max got his slice, and Rocky, as always, waited patiently for something to come to him at the end. "You know," Megan began, wiping her hands on a napkin, "I think that for the first time in a long time, I don't need to run after anything." I looked at her, feeling that these words meant more than she said. "This is good." She stretched out her hand and intertwined her fingers with mine. "Because I don't want to go anywhere else." I squeezed her hand, and we sat in silence, listening to the wind rustling in the trees. Max fell asleep right on the terrace, and Rocky laid down at our feet, sighing with pleasure. This new stage was calm, and I knew that now our house was filled with something that had been missing for a long time. After a few weeks, Megan and I started to notice that Max was no longer a puppy. His paws grew bigger and his energy didn't diminish, but now he laid next to Rocky more often, watching life go on as it did. One evening, when we were all on the terrace, Max suddenly raised his head, looked warily at the gate, and growled softly. "What is it?" Megan asked, looking into the darkness. I got up, went down to the yard, and squinted my eyes. "Nothing. Perhaps the neighbor's cat is walking under the fence again." Max didn't calm down immediately, but Rocky just sighed and put his head on his paws. Megan smiled. "You see, even Rocky knows when to panic and when not to." I sat down next to her and hugged her shoulders. "Rocky is wiser than all of us." At this point, Max decided that the danger was over and fell to the grass, rolling onto his back. "He's growing up just like Rocky," Megan said, watching them. "This is a good example to follow." We sat in silence until darkness completely enveloped the yard. ####. The next morning I woke up to Megan fussing in the kitchen. "What happened?" I muttered, walking into the room in just a t-shirt. "Max ate part of my sneakers." I stopped and looked at the culprit, who was sitting under the table with the same look that always appeared after another prank. Rocky just lay there, pretending that he had nothing to do with it. "He looks like he's still a bit of a puppy," I laughed. Megan folded her arms across her chest, trying to look serious, but eventually she laughed too. "I had plans for these sneakers." "Max decided that you had other plans." Megan sat down at the table and pulled Max closer to her by his collar. "Okay, you are living here for now only because I love you." Max wagged his tail without any remorse. "And I live here because I love you?" I joked, sitting down across from him. Megan raised an eyebrow and smiled. "Well, this is also a good bonus." I took her hand and squeezed her fingers. "I think we all fit into this picture quite well." Megan leaned closer and said quietly. "And I think so." Max barked as if to confirm our words. Rocky just sighed. A few days later, we decided to go out of town, just to get away from everything. Megan suggested the lake where Rocky and I used to go, even before Max came into our lives. The morning started with chaos. Max couldn't sit still, jumping around in the trunk and pulling things back out while I tried to pack everything. Rocky sat patiently by his side, watching with philosophical calm. "Max, it's a blanket, not your toy." Megan laughed, pulling the old blanket out of his mouth. "He is trying to be useful." "Yeah, he's trying to get everything out of the car." Eventually, we hit the road. Max looked out the window with interest, and Rocky lay down behind him, comfortably seated on his side of the seat. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. When we arrived, the sun was already high in the sky. Max was the first to jump out of the car and immediately ran to the water, making waves. He doesn't even wait for the team, Megan said, throwing the blanket on the grass. Max lives by his own rules. We put our things away, and I watched Megan sit by the shore, stretching her legs out to the water. Rocky came over and lay down next to her, putting his head on her lap. Max was still running around in the shallow water, not paying attention to anyone. It's like old times, she said, looking at the lake. I sat down next to her and ran my hand down her back. Only now we have two. Megan smiled and put her head on my shoulder. And I think it's right. We sat there for a few hours, just enjoying the peace and quiet, until Max decided to bring us a branch the size of half a tree. That's who the real hunter is, Megan said, wiping water from his face. Rocky just sighed, as usual. It wasn't a special day, but it's moments like this that stay with you the longest. A few weeks later, life went even more smoothly. Max stopped chewing on his shoes and finally realized that furniture is not a toy. Evenings were spent on the terrace, where Rocky lay under our feet, and Max spun around us, bringing his toys or pulling another branch from the flower garden. One evening, Megan sat wrapped in a blanket and silently stared at the fire in the portable grill I had set up near the terrace. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, sitting down next to him. She thought a bit before answering. "I don't remember the last time I felt so calm." Max laid down at her feet, and Rocky watched his every move as if to make it clear, "This is my next lesson in calmness for you." "It's nice here, isn't it?" she continued. "Yes," I answered, looking at the burning flames. Megan turned to me, her fingers touching my arm. "Have you ever thought that it could be forever?" I looked at her, feeling my heart start to beat a little faster. "What exactly are you talking about?" Megan looked down for a second, then said quietly. "About us. About this house. About everything that is here." Rocky lifted his head as if he felt the tension in the air. Max jumped up to him, not noticing the seriousness of the moment, and sat down next to him, pawing at Megan's blanket. I hugged her, leaning closer. "Megan. I've been thinking about this for a long time." She raised her head and met my gaze. "Then why are we still talking about it in hints?" I laughed. "Because I was waiting for you to say it first." Megan shook her head and laughed with me. "You are incorrigible." "I mean it. If you stay here forever, I'll be happy." She took my hand and squeezed it tighter. "I think I've been here a long time." Max barked as if to confirm her words, and Rocky just closed his eyes again, sighing contentedly. It was indeed more than just peace of mind. It was a new chapter in which there was no room for doubt. A few days after that conversation, Megan started bringing even more of her stuff into the house. Her books appeared on the windowsills and an additional row of clothes in the closet. Max helped her with the unpacking, pulling sweaters out of boxes and dragging them all over the house, while Rocky calmly watched the chaos from the corner of the room. One morning I woke up before Megan did. The sun was just starting to peek through the curtains, and the room was filled with a soft light. She was sleeping snuggled up to me, and Max was tucked in at our feet, snoring so loudly that even Rocky downstairs raised his head. I looked at it for a long time, realizing how much things have changed over the past year. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. In the evening of the same day, Megan came into the kitchen while I was preparing dinner. "I have an idea," she said, sitting down on the countertop and swinging her legs. "I'm listening. Let's make a small renovation in the living room. Something fresh." I turned around and looked at her. "Do you want to change something?" Megan shrugged her shoulders. "No, I love this house. I just wish it reflected us more." I laughed. We already have 2 dogs. I think this reflects our lifestyle quite well. She laughed too, but then said seriously. This used to be your home. Now I want it to be ours. I put the frying pan on the stove and came closer. There is no doubt about it. Megan looked at me and smiled. Then tomorrow I'll go to get the paint. Okay, but if Max falls into it, it's your problem. At that moment, Max raised his head and sneezed loudly, as if he realized that he had become the topic of conversation. Rocky, as usual, just turned away and went back to sleep. ####. We spent the next weekend painting the walls and rearranging the furniture. Max helped, or rather, he had to be wiped off the paint every 5 minutes. Rocky was just lying in the corner, watching everything like a real watchdog. When we finished, the living room looked completely different, brighter, fresher. Megan stood in the middle of the room, wiping the paint off her cheek. I think this is definitely our home now. I approached her, hugging her from behind. Ours. Max jumped next to him, leaving a white streak on the couch. Good, and a little bit of him. Megan laughed, hugging my hands. Rocky sighed and seemed to accept the fact that this place would definitely never be calm again. The next morning, when the sun was just starting to rise, I woke up to Max pulling something out of the boxes again. Megan was lying next to me, covered with a blanket almost to the head. I got up quietly so as not to wake her up and went out into the living room. Max was already sitting in the middle of the room with my old sneaker in his teeth, and Rocky was lying next to him, looking at him as if he was trying to explain to his younger friend how to behave again. Really? I looked at Max, who just wagged his tail and put his sneaker on the floor. Rocky raised his head and shrugged his shoulders. Okay, you won. But next time, leave something intact. I took the shoes and threw them back into the box, but Max had already switched to the blanket on the couch. While I was struggling with him, Megan came out of the room, wiping her eyes. Did they destroy something again? Max traditional. She came up to him and ran her hand over his head. He is still learning. At this rate, he will eat half an apartment by the time he finishes this training. Megan laughed and nodded at Rocky. He has a good teacher. He will grow up to be like Rocky. Rocky yawned, as if he wasn't going to raise anyone. I put my arms around Megan's waist and kissed her temple. I am changing with you too. She smiled, tilting her head toward me. And that's a good thing. Max, meanwhile, dragged the blanket with him to the terrace and lay down on it as if it were his trophy. Rocky just raised his head, sighed, and fell asleep again, leaving everything as it was. It looks like they have already agreed to divide the property, I joked. Megan took a cup of coffee and sat on the steps of the terrace, watching Max chase a butterfly around the yard. I'm happy, Nick. I sat down next to her and put my arms around her, looking at it all from the same place where Rocky lay down at our feet. Me neither. And there was more to it than just words. Summer quietly turned into fall. Max had grown up, but his energy remained just as unbridled. Rocky seemed to have come to terms with this reality, and now they often ran around the yard together. One evening, when the leaves were already beginning to cover the ground, Megan sat on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket, watching Max try to jump after a squirrel. He will never catch it, she said, laughing. But he will not stop trying. I sat down next to her and put a cup of hot tea in her hands. You know, I think you and I are a little bit like him, too, Megan said, looking out into the yard. In what sense? She turned her head to me. We also ran after something for a long time before we realized that what we needed was right there. I smiled and hugged her. Perhaps it was just the right time. Max came running up to us with a branch in his teeth and sat down right in front of the terrace, proudly displaying his prey. Rocky calmly lay down a little further and closed his eyes again, ignoring his younger friend's fuss. I love this place, Megan said, looking at the house. Our home, I corrected. She nodded, squeezing my hand tighter. Yeah. It is. Max suddenly jumped up and ran after the squirrel, which was sitting defiantly on a branch, wagging its tail. Megan laughed. This yard will never be quiet. I looked at her and shrugged my shoulders. I think this is exactly what we needed. Megan snuggled closer, and we sat there while the sun hid behind the trees and Rocky snored softly next to us. Life became simpler. But there was something real in this simplicity. Autumn was gradually approaching its peak. Leaves covered the paths in the yard, and Max chased them tirelessly, jumping up and down and trying to catch them, as if it were some big game he had invented for himself. Rocky, as always, was lying on the porch, watching with wise calm. One morning, when Megan and I were having coffee on the terrace, she spoke up. I was thinking about Christmas. I looked up from my cup. Already? It's still October. Megan smiled as she wrapped herself in a blanket. Yes, but this year I want it to be special. The first one in our house. I looked at her carefully. Do we have traditions now? That's right. And I have a few ideas. At that moment, Max ran up with a stick and solemnly placed it on the terrace, looking at us proudly, as if it was his contribution to the preparations for the holidays. I think he also wants to be part of the tradition, I laughed. Megan leaned over, patted Max's head, and threw the stick aside. But seriously, let's invite your friends and mine. Let's have a lot of people in the house. I thought for a moment, watching the leaves slowly fall from the trees. It's a good idea. She raised her head and looked at me with that slight smile I had seen on her since the first days. And you really don't mind all this? I took her hand and intertwined my fingers with hers. I'm all for it. Rocky raised his head when he heard our voices, and Max ran around the yard again, trying to catch the wind. Okay, then I'll start planning, Megan said, already flipping through her phone. I sighed, knowing that it would be bigger than I expected, but I felt warm inside. It was really something new, traditions, home filled with laughter and people. Max ran over and licked my hand, as if to support this idea. Okay, boy, you'll be in charge of the Christmas tree, I joked, stroking his ear. Rocky just sighed and covered his eyes. It seems that this time we were going to have a really special Christmas. Winter has come. The first snow fell early in the morning. I woke up to Max running around the yard, leaving footprints on the thin white bedspread. Megan was still sleeping, wrapped in a blanket, and Rocky was lying at her feet, softly snoring. I went out on the terrace with a cup of coffee, watching Max catch snowflakes, barking at them as if they were responding to him. Rocky slowly followed me out, stopped at the door, and sighed, looking at Max. Is he tired yet? Megan asked, going out onto the terrace and wrapping herself in a blanket. I don't think so. He still has enough energy to last through the winter. Megan sat down next to me and took my cup, taking a sip. Now you can definitely feel that Christmas is coming. I nodded, watching the snow gradually cover the yard. Do you think we'll have time to buy a Christmas tree this week? Megan looked at me with a sly smile. Actually, I've already ordered one. It should be here today. I raised an eyebrow. Did you decide everything without me? You said I could plan. Yes, but the Christmas tree is a serious part of the tradition. Don't worry. It's huge. Max will definitely be thrilled. Max, hearing his name, ran up to the terrace, covered in snow, and shook it off on our feet. He's already excited, I laughed, wiping my pants. Rocky, with the expression, I didn't sign up for this, went back inside. ####. When the Christmas tree was delivered, Max was the first to rush to smell it. Megan laughed as she watched him try to grab one of the branches with his teeth. "Max, you can't eat it," she said, taking him by the collar. I helped the workers bring the tree into the living room. I think he decided that it was too big a stick for him. I hope he doesn't decide to tear it down when we decorate it. Megan stopped, looking at the Christmas tree that already occupied half the room. "It is really big. Maybe I exaggerated a bit." I laughed. "Now you definitely can't give up the tradition." Max barked and sat down in front of the tree as if he agreed. Rocky lay back in his seat and watched with the same patience that comes with experience. It was our first Christmas together in this house. And even though the Christmas tree took up half the living room, I knew it would be the best Christmas in years. The evening of decorating the Christmas tree turned into chaos. Max, as expected, thought that all the toys on the tree were his new play trophies. We would hang balls, and he would immediately take them off with his paw or teeth. Rocky just laid in the corner, keeping his eyes on us, as if he had already seen it all and was tired before we started. "Maybe we should just give him one ball and he'll calm down," I suggested, trying to save another toy that Max had already taken off. Megan laughed and threw Max an old wooden star that had already lost its luster. "Okay, here's your jewelry." Max grabbed it and carried it under the Christmas tree, where he sat down as if it were his reward for helping. "I think he'll be busy now," Megan said, hanging another garland. "Let's see how long it will last." ####. When the Christmas tree was almost decorated, Megan approached a box with a top in the shape of a large gold star. "Nick, you have to play it. It's tradition." I took the star and climbed up on the stool, feeling Max watching my every move. "Max, don't even think about jumping," I warned, noticing how he tensed his paws. Megan grabbed him by the collar just in time. "You stay here. Let the people finish." The star took its place at the top, and we stepped back to evaluate the result. "It looks perfect," Megan said, leaning against me. I hugged her and kissed her temple. "I think Max thinks so too." Max sat down in front of the Christmas tree and barked loudly, as if confirming our words. Rocky raised his head and looked at him, and then, as if resigned, went back to sleep. ####. Later that evening, we sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, with glasses of wine in our hands. The Christmas tree was glowing with garlands, Max was dozing at our feet, and Rocky was lying lazily a little further away, lost in thought. "Nick," Megan said quietly, looking at the lights reflected in her eyes. "Yes?" She turned to me and smiled. "I am really home." I hugged her tighter, feeling the peace envelop us both. "Me neither." Max sighed as he rolled over onto his back, and Rocky barely opened one eye, as if to confirm that this was a real home for him, too. It was our first Christmas together, and I knew that we had many more such evenings ahead of us. The next morning I woke up to Max jumping on the bed and licking my face. Okay, I'm getting up," I muttered, trying to push him away with my paws. Megan stretched out and, hiding her head under the blanket, muttered. "Why does he always choose you?" "Because I am the weakest link," I laughed, sitting on the edge of the bed. Rocky was lying quietly by the door, watching everything, like a true guardian of peace. I went into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. It was still lightly snowing outside, and the Christmas tree we had put up in the yard was flickering with lights. Max ran around her, sniffing the gifts that Megan had put under the branches the day before. "You know that if he finds his present, he'll destroy it before Christmas, right?" Megan said, walking into the kitchen wearing my t-shirt. I thought it was part of the tradition to fight his curiosity. She took the cup and sat down next to him, looking at Max. "He's too smart. I think he just wants more attention." Megan smiled thoughtfully. "In this he is like me." I pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. "You will also receive your gift. But you will have to wait. Do you have a clue what it will be?" "This is a surprise." Megan squinted her eyes and raised an eyebrow. Okay. But if it has anything to do with kitchen appliances, I'll kick you out. I laughed. I'm not that stupid. Rocky, meanwhile, slowly stood up and stretched, then followed Max, as if to check if he was going to do something again. Look, he's guarding the Christmas tree again. It's more like tired tolerance, Megan said. ####. We spent the evening on the terrace, setting the table with light snacks and wine. The snow was falling slowly, settling on the trees. It's so quiet, Megan whispered, looking out at the yard. The house lives its own life. She took my hand and said quietly, I like this silence. Max and Rocky were lying next to each other on the bedding, curled up in a ball. I looked at her, feeling a sense of calm growing inside me. I think we found what we were looking for. Megan squeezed my hand tighter. I think so too. It was a moment I wanted to remember. Simple but important at the same time. The next morning I woke up to a light knock on the window. The snow was falling again, slowly covering the tree branches. Max was already sitting by the door, waiting patiently to be let out. Rocky, as always, was lying next to him, calm and unhurried. I got up quietly so as not to wake Megan and opened the door to the terrace. Max took off like a rocket, cutting through the snow with his paws. Rocky followed, walking carefully, as if checking every step. Is it fun? I asked and Max started running around in circles. Rocky just looked at me, his eyes saying something like, I'm old enough for this. I stood there watching them until I heard footsteps behind me. You couldn't sleep again? Megan hugged me from behind, hiding her face in my back. Max woke me up. And the snow. She walked out onto the terrace with her legs tucked in and sat down on a chair. It's so quiet here, she said, looking out at the courtyard. I could live in this moment forever. Max ran up to her and started shoveling snow right on her feet. But without that, Megan laughed, trying to push him away with her paws. He wants to share moments with you. Megan patted him on the head, and Max happily put his head in her lap. Do you think we'll ever grow up with him? She jokingly asked. I don't think this is in our plans. Rocky sighed at this point and laid down next to the chair, as if agreeing that someone in this house had to be an adult after all. ####. That day we finally decided to complete the last preparations for Christmas. Megan brought a box of jewelry, and I lit the fireplace. The living room smelled like pine needles, and the air was light and cozy. I think it's going to be a special Christmas, Megan said as she hung the garland over the fireplace. Why do you think so? She stopped, looking at me over her shoulder. Because it is with you for the first time. I walked over and hugged her, running my fingers along her arm. Both with Max and Rocky. They are a part of us, she added quietly, leaning closer. At that moment, Max had already found the presents under the tree and gently began to lick one of them. Max. Megan immediately raised her finger. Not yet. I laughed and pulled her to the couch. Let's give him a little present now. Otherwise he won't live to see the evening. Megan thought for a while, then pulled out a small bone wrapped in paper. Only one. Max ran over as if he had heard it a kilometer away. Rocky approached slowly, but as always, he kept his distance, as if to say, thank you, I'll wait my turn. That evening, our house was filled not only with the light of garlands, but also with the warmth that comes only when you are really where you are supposed to be. Christmas Eve came unnoticed. The lights of the Christmas tree flickered in the living room, and the fire in the fireplace crackled, filling the room with warmth and comfort. Megan was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, and Max was dozing at her feet with his head on his paws. Rocky, as always, chose a place a little further away, by the fireplace, where he lay quietly, feeling like the main guardian of the house. It's a perfect evening, Megan said, hugging my hand. I ran my hand through her hair and smiled. It is perfect not because everything is so beautiful, but because we are here together. Megan raised her head and kissed me on the cheek. You start talking like a real romantic. It's because you're there for me. Max raised his head when he heard our voices and immediately ran closer, sticking his nose between us. Here's the third in our company, Megan laughed, patting him on the back. Don't forget about Rocky. I looked at the older dog, who just lazily raised his head and looked at us as if it was none of his business. He's wiser than the rest of us, Megan said, and he knows exactly when it's best to stay out of it. I think he just knows that he will receive his gift later. Max jumped up to the tree and began to sniff the presents. Only Max is not so patient yet, I laughed. Megan stood up, took out a small package and handed it to Max. This is an official gift. From Santa. Max barked happily and grabbed the package, carrying it to his seat. Rocky slowly got up and came closer, too. Megan pulled out another box wrapped in red paper and handed it to him. You got something too. Rocky carefully took the box with his teeth and carried it to the rug by the fireplace. They are like children, Megan said, watching them. I put my arms around her waist and kissed the top of her head. Perhaps that's why our home is so lively. Megan sat down next to me again, and we watched in silence as Max tore the paper to get the toy, and Rocky calmly opened his package with his paw, as if he had done it many times before. It was snowing outside, and I knew that we would remember this Christmas for a long time. The next morning, the house looked like Max had been celebrating Christmas alone all night. The wrapping paper was torn to shreds and scattered all over the living room. Max was sitting in the middle of this crime scene, looking innocent, chewing on the remains of the ribbon from the gift. Rocky was lying quietly in his seat by the fireplace, with a look on his face as if he had nothing to do with it. Megan walked into the room, stretching after her nap, and stopped at the threshold, looking around at the mess. Did he celebrate without us? It looks like it, I said, pointing to Max. Max wagged his tail and ran up to Megan with the same ribbon in his teeth, offering a game. This is his gift for you, I joked. Megan sat down and started pulling the tape out of his teeth. Max, you are unpredictable. Rocky yawned and stretched, finally getting up and slowly walking over to me. Someone here is behaving with dignity, I said, scratching him behind the ear. Megan lifted the wrapping paper and smiled. I love it. This chaos is part of what makes our Christmas real. I went up to her and hugged her, running my hand down her back. And I love it. Megan raised her head and looked me in the eye. What are we going to do today? How about a walk with the guys? It's snowing, the lake is frozen, we can go there. Max heard the word walk and immediately jumped up, running around us several times. I think he agrees. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. In the afternoon, we went to the lake. Max ran ahead, leaving footprints in the snow, and Rocky walked slowly next to Megan and me. Megan took my hand and squeezed it tightly. I know I say this a lot, but I feel like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. I stopped, turning to her, and ran my fingers over her cheek. You were always supposed to be here. Megan smiled and snuggled closer. And this will be our new beginning. Rocky stopped and looked at us, and Max was already running in circles on the frozen lake. It's the beginning, I repeated, looking at our small but already so important family. On our way back from the lake, Megan and I walked slowly, enjoying the silence of the winter forest. Max ran ahead of us, leaving footprints in the snow, and Rocky, as always, kept close, stopping from time to sniff each tree. He seems to be looking for traces of another pack, Megan joked, patting Rocky on the back. Or just checking to see if we're lost, I said, squeezing her hand a little tighter. Megan stopped and turned to me. Nick. What? She looked at me for a long time, as if she was searching for words, then exhaled steam into the cold air. "I've been wanting to tell you something for a long time." I raised my eyebrows, waiting for what would happen next. "I don't think I can imagine my life without it, without you, Max, Rocky, this house." I smiled and ran my hand over her cheek. "You know, me too." "Really? You feel the same way I do. And it's beautiful." Max ran up to us, jumping around and distracting us with his tail, which was wagging so fast that it almost knocked snow off the branches. "Okay, Max, we get it," Megan laughed, bending down to pet him. Rocky came closer, stood next to Max, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, put his head on my arm. "He agrees with you," I said, giving Rocky a quick glance. Megan leaned closer and kissed me on the lips. "Let's go home." We returned to the house, where the lights of the Christmas tree were still glowing in the living room. I took off Megan's coat, and we both sat down on the couch, wrapped in blankets. Max laid down again at our feet, and Rocky quietly lay down by the fireplace, warming himself with the warmth. "I think," Megan said, looking at the fire, "this is the best Christmas ever." I hugged her and whispered, "And this is just the beginning." At that moment, I realized that we had finally found peace. No matter what happened in the past, we were creating a new life, and that was a real gift. The next few days passed in peace, as if everything around me had frozen along with the snow outside the window. Megan spent a lot of time by the fireplace with a book, and I was doing the little things around the house that always accumulate in winter. Max was tirelessly running around the yard, leaving footprints on every piece of snow, and Rocky, as always, was just there. One evening, when everything was quiet, I was sitting on the terrace with a cup of hot tea. Megan came out after me, wrapped in my sweater, which looked twice as big on her. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting down next to me. I looked at the lights that decorated our yard for a long time and answered. "About how quickly everything changed." Megan leaned against me. "Are you happy with these changes?" I nodded, feeling the warmth of her hand in my palm. Yes, I do." At that moment, Max ran out onto the terrace, sliding across the wooden floor, and immediately laid down at our feet. "He's definitely not going to survive the spring without incident," Megan laughed as she watched him. "The main thing is that these adventures are not inside the house." Megan smiled as she looked at me. "Nick, are you happy?" I looked at her, ran my fingers over her cheek, and whispered, "Yeah. And it's thanks to you." Megan kissed me, and at that moment I realized that I wasn't looking for anything else. Life has become something I didn't even expect, simple, but full of important little things. Rocky quietly walked out onto the terrace and lay down next to Max, sighing as if he had finally found his place. "This is our home now," Megan said, looking into the distance. I hugged her and answered quietly, "We have always been there. Only now we are here together." Max lifted his head and barked as if agreeing with these words, and Rocky just closed his eyes calmly. It was the end of one stage and the beginning of a new one, our life together. Christmas was over, and winter was gradually receding. One morning, when the first ray of sunlight broke through the curtains, I woke up to a quiet rustling in the house. Megan stood by the window, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the yard, where Max was already running through the remaining snow, and Rocky was lazily watching him from the porch. I walked up to her, hugged her from behind, and leaned my chin against her shoulder. "What did you see there?" Megan smiled and tilted her head toward mine. "It's nothing special. I just love these mornings." We stood there in silence, listening to the house wake up with us. Rocky finally got up, stretched, and slowly followed Max, who was jumping around in the snow, looking for a stick under the ice. "It's strange," Megan whispered. "I used to always want more. More travel, more change, more noise in my life. I ran my hand lightly over her shoulder. And now? She turned to me, her eyes sparkling with warmth. And now I just want it to never end. I kissed her on the forehead and answered quietly. And it will not end. Max ran to the door and barked impatiently, demanding to be let in. Someone wants breakfast, Megan laughed. Rocky stopped at the threshold and looked at us as if inviting us to join him. Well, I said, opening the door, a new day begins. Max flew inside, shaking the snow from his fur, and Rocky followed, taking his place by the fireplace again. Megan took my hand, and we went to the kitchen together to prepare breakfast.